that we can use to understand Revelation. But Pirkei Avot is quite clear. The rabbis that wrote this Mishnah are quite clear that Moses received every single letter of the Torah just the way God intends it, and we can understand it. And that is the basis of our understanding of Revelation, which has ramifications for how we're going to observe Jewish. Okay, so let's continue taking a look here. And I certainly want to come back with questions about those first four words. But let's try to get to the end of this Mishnah, and then we can open it up. So, Sarah Yehoshua, Yehoshua Lizkenim, Uzkenim, L'Nevi'im, L'Nevi'im, Masruha, L'Anshe, Knesset Hagdolah. Okay, so Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, gave it to Joshua, right? All the words, the way of understanding it, all given over to Joshua, who you may know was the leader, right, that took over for Moses to bring the children of Israel over the Jordan River and to conquer the land of Israel. Joshua was that leader. Now, Joshua wasn't a scholar. It's even interesting that this is how this transmission is claimed to have been. Nevertheless, Joshua, very close to Moses, Moshe gives it to Joshua, and Joshua, in turn, gives it to the elders, right? Probably the scholars of his day, or the judges in his day. And the elders gives it over to the prophets. So we read, of course, in the Bible that the prophets come. It's the second part of the Bible. And the prophets had various understandings of the way the Jewish people should act. They're very harsh regarding judgmental, regarding the behavior of the Jewish people and why the Jewish people were defeated by their enemies. But the prophets spoke with God. So everything that Moses received got into the hands of the prophets, and the prophets had a close relationship with God as well, which determined what their traditions would be and passed on to the Jewish people. But in terms of this transmission of law and of Torah, it was given over to the prophets for a time, and the prophets gave it to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly was really a high court in a sense. It began what we would call rabbinic law, rabbinic tradition, and they were the precursors of rabbinic tradition, an assembly of high judges, so to speak, who would be able to take the tradition of the Torah and begin to look at it and interpret it, moving on to what would become the Pharisees or the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud. And they were kind of proto-Pharisees, right? Proto-rabbis, the men of the Great Assembly. So at this point already we're seeing that the Torah and its traditions were given to individuals, even individual prophets, but the prophets ended up turning over this tradition to the men of the Great Assembly, and they began to deliberate on this. And that's what we see already in Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. And then we come to one of the sayings. And we're going to stop here, and after this saying, talk a little bit about it, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Hem amru shlosha dvarim, right? The men of the Great Assembly said three things. It said, Heve mitunim badin, v'ha'amidu talmidim harbe, v'hasu siyag l'torah. This is what the men of the Great Assembly said. This is their saying. This is their teaching. In a sense, obviously, the men of the Great Assembly talked more than three things. They they deliberated on hundreds of things, but here seems to be something fundamental to the advice that they're giving, not to normal people, not to you and me, but to the judges of our people. And you can see that in the language. It says, be patient in the administration of justice, right? You could also interpret this, be deliberate in issues of justice. And what do we mean by that? That a judge has a very important role in society. And the last thing you want in a judge is someone that's going to respond impulsively, that's going to think about something just for a second and make his determination. That's not what we want in our judges. According to the men of the Great Assembly, they're saying deliberate slowly, get all of the information you can, and think about it. No impulsive judgments. Only a fool would judge impulsively. The kind of judges we want in our lives are judges that are patient, that are deliberate, that are slow, determining in a very deep way what the law should be and what the litigants deserve. It's very important in terms of judges. They're addressing judges now. Be patient, be slow, be deliberate, and make sure your ruling is just. Okay, the second thing that the men of the Great Assembly say is raise many disciples. Now, this is important in Jewish tradition generally. We don't learn things just to know them. We learn things to also teach them, right? We have to be deliberate in our justice, but we have to teach our disciples about justice as well. It's not good enough just to learn. Lil mod, lil amed. We learn so that we can teach. So find yourself students, raise them up, teach them at your feet, so to speak, and make sure you've got judges, budding judges that will follow you, learning your understanding of what is right. They pass down generation to generation of judges. We're not even talking about regular people right now, but of judges. You have, as a judge, you need to train potentially new judges and make sure that there will be another generation of judges that follow you. So we learn and we teach. And the final thing that the men of the Great Assembly said is make a fence around the Torah. Now, what does that mean? Siyag l'Torah, make a fence around the Torah. That means that we have to be very careful when it comes to deliberating on Torah or observing Torah, observing the laws of the Torah. Because observing the laws of the Torah is a fundamental understanding of being a Jew. You have to follow the laws of the Torah, but lest you transgress a negative prohibition that we find in the Torah, you have to put a fence around it, so to speak. So you can't even get close to breaking a prohibition of the Torah. So let me see if we can come up with an example of putting a fence around the Torah. We've all been dealing with what we're eating during Passover right now. And in Ashkenazi tradition, you don't eat kitniot, which are legumes, which are things like rice and peas and peanuts, and all of these things that are by themselves not treif for Passover. But in Ashkenazi tradition, they look like chametz, so you don't eat them. And that's why so many of us are anxious about these legumes because they look like chametz, lest, God forbid, you actually eat real chametz. And that's a siyag l'Torah. That's making a fence around the Torah. Just to say that in Sephardic tradition, there is no prohibition of kitniot. And some who say now that even for Ashkenazim, we shouldn't observe the prohibitions of kitniot. That suffice to say, Ashkenazi Jews, for the most part, are setting up and creating a fence around the Torah lest, God forbid, we eat chametz, we shouldn't even eat anything that reminds us of chametz or might look like chametz. And that's the situation with the kitniot. So this is what we learn from the men of the Great Assembly. And as we move forward in Pirkei Avot, we keep this in mind. This is what judges need to think about. This is what Torah scholars need to think about. And I guess all the more so that the rest of us should think about as we move on in Pirkei Avot. Okay, that's the first Mishnah. I wanted to open it up now. You can unmute yourself. If you have any questions or comments or challenges, however you might see this first Mishnah, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Hi, I have one question.
Yes, Tom.
It says raise many disciples. So how are the Haredim, the big controversy in Israel, of course, is, they don't want to work, or many of them don't want to work, and whatever, the drill. So how do they can say, yeah, raise many disciples, but you also have to feed them. So how is it that they work that through in their minds that that they are not necessarily pulling their full weight as far as contributing to the economy?
I can't speak for Haredim. I can't fully understand how they see the world. But I can imagine that the Haredim see the world in completely Jewish legal terms, foundational Jewish principles. And in their mind, studying Torah is helping the Jewish people move forward. So that they're not involved in the economy, they're not having jobs that contribute to Israeli society. That's not, it doesn't seem like it's an issue for them because the men should be learning in the kollel, and that's their contribution in a certain sense to transmit Jewish law and tradition. The women in those communities are asked to work and somehow support the family, but as you know, Tom, they're very poor in those communities, and they see themselves as observing God's will, the way they do it, and no community is better of transmitting the tradition and the way of looking at the world and the way of observing Jewish law in the world than Haredim. They have lots of children, and all the children study in religious schools all the way through. They keep the outside world in a certain sense restricted, and they do and they think and they live every single day according to a very strict understanding of Jewish law, like Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. Exactly what we have in our Chumashim is exactly God's word, and all of their understandings, all the interpretations of God's will in the Talmud and codes and everything that follows is word for word, and they know exactly what they need to do, and that's what they teach their children. They're very good at it. So that's the Haredim. There's certainly more to be said about them, and I just don't know everything about it. But being involved in meaningful, productive work in the Israeli economy or in Williamsburg, right, or in Crown Heights, they don't see that as a priority. They see instead studying and Jewish law and Jewish living as their priority. Any other questions? Okay, so we will, one other thing I wanted to mention about this Mishnah, and that is there are two understandings of Jewish law. There is Torah shebichtav, that is the Torah that comes word for word from God to the Chumash. And we see that in what we have in the Torah scrolls is exactly what God says. But we also have another tradition, Torah sheba'al peh, and that is the interpretation, essentially, of the Chumash, right, of the 5 books of Moses. And every other sacred text in our tradition would be called the oral Torah. So we have the written Torah, 5 books of Moses, Bible for the most part. But then we have the oral Torah, which was transmitted orally. That's why they call it that. Initially transmitted orally. Now we have texts that have been written out and so on. But the understanding is that would be oral, and that is the traditions that we see in the Mishnah, which is the first half of the Talmud, and the Gemara, the second half of the Talmud, that understands, takes the laws of the Torah and expands and expounds on them, so that we end up with a lot of law, much of which has been interpreted from legal understandings of the Torah. So when we talk about Torah, we're talking about not just the written, but the oral Torah as well. And this is what we mean in this first chapter, this first Mishnah, when we're saying that the transmission was from Moshe all the way to the members of the Great Assembly, who began the oral tradition, talking, right, in conversation, teasing out the law in that way. That's the oral Torah, and first 5 books of Moses in the Bible, for the most part, are the written Torah. Okay, those two understandings of Torah are very important as we move forward with all of this, and I'm hoping that we created a little bit of a foundation today so that we can move on with the second Mishnah and work on that. So when are we going to do that? Again, we're going to try to take 30 minutes of your day at noontime, 12 to 12:30. We're going to do that on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Obviously, we've got Yontif coming up tomorrow and Thursday, so we won't be doing it this Thursday. But next week, Tuesday and Thursday, we'll keep moving through this until we get to Shavuot. And I think it will be enjoyable for all of us to be together for these 30 minutes. So next Tuesday, next Thursday at the same time, and we'll just keep moving through Pirkei Avot the best we can. Any last comments before we end? All right, everybody. Chag Sameach. Have a great end of your Pesach holiday, and we'll see each other again next Tuesday.
Thank you,
Yasher
Rabbi.
koach.
Yes,
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Dollin.